You have a romantic relationship with every leading man you've ever starred with.
I make jokes about it, but I call it the cinema gods, and they mess with us. And the first thing that happens, usually, is the love scene.
Before you get to know each other?
For decades, one question has followed Diane Lane everywhere she goes. How much of the scandal was actually true? The rumors never seemed to stop. Stories about relationships, marriage troubles, and secret affairs spread for years, leaving many convinced they knew exactly what had happened. Were the affairs real? What really happened behind closed doors? And why has one of Hollywood's most admired actresses spent decades avoiding the kind of explanations that could have silenced the speculation once and for all? By the end of this video, the biggest surprise won't be what happened in Diane Lane's life. It will be how different the truth is from the story everyone thought they knew. The deeper story beneath the love affairs. They met at a premiere party for A Beautiful Mind in 2002. Diane and Josh Brolin, two serious actors with significant pedigrees, her history going back to childhood, his as the son of James Brolin and the stepson of Barbra Streisand. They started dating. By 2004, they were married. And within months of that wedding, everything fell apart publicly in the worst possible way. On the morning of December 5th, 2004, police were called to their home. Brolin was arrested on a misdemeanor charge of domestic battery after an LA police officer confirmed that Lane had called the police because Brolin had hit her. He was taken in, booked, released. Diane declined to press charges. Their representatives called it a misunderstanding. They tried to move forward, and for a while, for nearly 9 years, they did. But here's the element of this story that doesn't get examined enough. The domestic battery arrest happened in December 2004. She didn't file for divorce until 2013. That is 8.5 years of a marriage continuing after an incident serious enough to involve police, a booking, and a public record. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you something about how complicated domestic situations are in real life, far more complicated than the clean narratives we construct around them. A woman who grew up watching relationships fail, who spent years trying to make a marriage to Christopher Lambert work even when she described herself as essentially alone within it, who has talked about wanting, desperately, to belong to someone and have someone belong to her. She wasn't a naive woman who didn't see what was happening. She was a woman who had never in her life had a model for what a stable, healthy love looks like, and who kept trying to find it anyway. When she did file for divorce in 2013, she cited irreconcilable differences. She asked for no spousal support, no child support. They had no children together. What we do know is that by 2013, she was finally done, and she's never looked back publicly. For decades, attention has focused on the men, the marriages, and the rumors surrounding Diane Lane's love life. Most conversations stop there. They focus on who was involved, what happened, and why certain relationships ended. But the more interesting question is not who entered the story. The more interesting question is what connected them. Because there appears to be a pattern, and Diane Lane may have pointed directly to it with that memorable rock bleeder comment. Looking across the most significant relationships in Diane Lane's life, a common thread begins to emerge. The men involved often seemed unavailable in some fundamental way. Not necessarily unavailable romantically, but emotionally. Careers, personal struggles, or emotional limitations frequently stood between connection and consistency, leaving an ongoing sense of something missing. The childhood nobody talks about. Before any fame, before any film roles, before any public fascination, there was a childhood shaped by instability, separation, and an unusually early introduction to the demands of adulthood. Diane Lane was born on January 22, 1965, in New York City. One detail immediately reframes the entire origin story. Parental separation occurred just 13 days after birth. Not years later, not after memories formed, but before life had even begun to settle into any recognizable family structure. Custody remained with the mother, Colleen Farrington, a nightclub singer and former Playboy centerfold, Miss October, 1957. Glamorous in public image, yet unpredictable in personal rhythm, her presence created an early environment defined more by inconsistency than stability. Early childhood unfolded in a world without steady routine, shaped by movement, change, and emotional unpredictability. Residence with the mother continued until approximately age 6. During those years, a contrasting influence emerged through the maternal grandmother, a Pentecostal preacher within the apostolic denomination. Within that environment, something unexpected took shape. The sermons, marked by rhythm, intensity, and theatrical delivery, offered an early, unintentional education in performance. Emotional crescendos, storytelling structure, and vocal command of an audience became foundational exposure to the mechanics of acting long before formal training ever began. At approximately age 6, custody transitioned to the father, Burton Eugene Lane, a drama coach associated with the theatrical world surrounding John Cassavetes, alongside work as a cab driver and later a humanities instructor at City College. He represented a different kind of household dynamic, blending structure with instability. Strong artistic influence existed within the home, along with deep investment in Diane Lane's emerging talent. Early enrollment at La Mama Experimental Theater Club placed a child actor within one of New York's most respected experimental performance spaces. By adolescence, performance had already become central. At around 12 years old, participation in a Joseph Papp production of The Cherry Orchard placed Diane Lane alongside Meryl Streep, marking early recognition within serious theatrical circles. Despite early artistic promise, domestic stability remained fragile. The mother reappeared intermittently, contributing to ongoing disruption. The father's household, while creatively nurturing, lacked consistent emotional grounding. Childhood unfolded in overlapping worlds without a stable center, requiring early adaptation to adult environments. By age 15, a sudden departure occurred with a boyfriend to California. A return followed, but instability persisted. The mother later located Diane Lane and relocated her to Georgia, prompting a legal custody dispute initiated by the father. During this period, teenage life intersected with financial independence and professional responsibility, leaving little room for a conventional adolescence. This foundation is not background detail alone. It is the structural beginning of everything that follows. A life shaped by early separation, competing parental influences, artistic immersion, and repeated emotional displacement. Within that environment, belonging was not experienced as permanence, but as something conditional, shifting, and continually negotiated. That early reality remains essential to understanding every later chapter that follows. The fall after the rise. She was 13 when director George Roy Hill cast her in A Little Romance, a film that also starred Sir Laurence Olivier. Not exactly a small debut, the film came out in 1979. Critically, it was received warmly, and the response to Diane specifically was extraordinary. Sir Laurence Olivier, called her the new Grace Kelly. Time magazine put her on their cover, a 13-year-old, on the cover of Time. That's the cultural weight of the moment we're talking about. Hollywood looked at Diane Lane and saw the future. She was beautiful in an unconventional way, not the manufactured, polished beauty that studios usually manufactured, but something raw and real. She had an inner life that translated on camera in a way that couldn't be taught. Directors who worked with her early spoke about it in almost mystical terms. The early 1980s seemed to confirm all of that promise. Francis Ford Coppola cast her in not one, but two films back-to-back. The Outsiders in 1983, where she starred alongside an almost absurdly stacked cast: Matt Dillon, Tom Cruise, Patrick Swayze, Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, C. Thomas Howell. And then Rumblefish, also in 1983, another Coppola film with Matt Dillon and Mickey Rourke. This is where we need to talk about something that almost never gets addressed properly. Because the early to mid-80s should have been Diane Lane's complete coronation as a superstar. She had everything: the talent, the looks, the momentum, the director relationships. And then it stalled. The Cotton Club came out in 1984 and was an expensive, messy flop despite its cast. Streets of Fire underperformed. Rumblefish was critically respected, but not a commercial hit. And the industry, which had been so in love with this teenage prodigy, started to cool off. Not because she stopped being talented, her talent was never in question, but because the transition from child sensation to adult star is one of the hardest things to navigate in Hollywood, and the industry at that time didn't quite know what to do with her. She fell out of the spotlight, moved to Georgia with her mother for a period. And this is the part of her story that most people completely skip over. She spent years in the wilderness professionally. Years of films that didn't work, roles that weren't right, and Hollywood that had moved on. But before that comeback, there was her personal life. And that's where the rumors really start. The love stories behind the headlines. The timeline of Diane Lane's relationships often gets told in a messy way, with details mixed up and missing context, even though the order of events actually helps everything make more sense. In the early 1980s, while working on The Outsiders and moving through young Hollywood, Diane Lane was linked to several well-known figures. Timothy Hutton, who had just won an Oscar for Ordinary People, was one of them. Christopher Atkins, who became famous from The Blue Lagoon, was another. Matt Dillon, who also starred with her in The Outsiders and Rumblefish, was part of that same early circle. What often gets missed here is how young all of this really was. These were teenage years and early adulthood, a time when most people are still figuring out who they are. Add sudden fame, constant attention, and being surrounded by other young actors in the same fast-moving world. And it makes sense that relationships would form quickly and sometimes feel complicated. It was not a settled stage of life. It was still the beginning. Around 1985, attention also turned to Jon Bon Jovi, who was just starting out before becoming a global rock star. The relationship was short and not talked about much by either side. Still, the pairing stands out. Diane Lane came from a creative, unusual family background, and Jon Bon Jovi was a working-class musician from New Jersey about to explode into worldwide fame. Both lived in performance-driven worlds, both were young, and both were stepping into huge careers at the same time. It was a moment that made sense in that stage of life, even if it did not last. The most important relationship that followed was with Christopher Lambert. They first met in 1984 in Paris during press for the Cotton Club. Lambert, a French actor who later became famous for Highlander, had a very different personality and background compared to the Hollywood world around her. They had a brief connection, then went their separate ways, and later met again about 2 years later while working on a film together. They got married in 1988. Diane Lane later spoke very openly in an interview about this period. She described feeling emotionally alone at times because of long periods of separation, and she shared a very honest feeling of wanting real closeness and stability. She used the phrase rock bleeder to describe herself, meaning someone who keeps trying to get emotional care from situations or people who may not be able to give it. It was a very honest way of explaining a difficult pattern she noticed in her own life. She and Christopher Lambert had a daughter together, Eleanor Jasmine Lambert, born in 1993. They divorced in 1994. Lambert has said he felt sad about later parts of Diane Lane's life, but both stayed respectful and connected through their daughter. Their separation did not come from a big public fight. It was more of a quiet understanding that the relationship was not working. There is also the story people often mention about Richard Gere. During the late 1980s and into the 1990s, rumors connected Diane Lane and Richard Gere in Hollywood conversations. Nothing was ever confirmed by either of them. They later worked together in Nights in Rodanthe in 2008, which made people talk about the connection again. What makes this interesting is that both were often described in similar ways. Richard Gere was known for his spiritual side and calm personality. Diane Lane has also been described as private and thoughtful. Because of that, people often imagined there was some kind of deeper connection, even if nothing was ever publicly confirmed. What remains clear is that they shared strong on-screen chemistry and continued working respectably together over the years. In Hollywood, sometimes that lasting creative connection is what stands out the most, even more than the rumors that surround it. The role that changed everything and the rumors it created. We cannot talk about Diane Lane without talking about Unfaithful, because this film, released in 2002, directed by Adrian Lyne, didn't just revive her career. It redefined how the public saw her, and it created a whole new layer of rumors that have followed her ever since. The premise? A happily married woman in suburban New York, played by Diane, has a passionate, destructive affair with a younger French book dealer, played by Olivier Martinez. Her husband, played by Richard Gere, discovers the affair and the consequences are devastating. Diane's performance in that film is extraordinary. It earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. And what made it so powerful, and this is the thing critics kept circling back to, was the specificity of her performance. The way she played the physical pull of the affair, the guilt, the exhilaration, the self-loathing. It didn't feel like acting. It felt like a memory. Which is exactly why the rumors started. Had Diane Lane herself been unfaithful in her marriage to Christopher Lambert? Was the emotional truth in her performance autobiographical? What stands out most is how the performance is understood through craft rather than confession. Diane Lane trained in experimental theater, where acting is built on emotional truth drawn from within, not surface imitation. That background changes how a role like this is approached. Instead of simply acting out a situation, the work often involves accessing emotional patterns, memories of feeling, and internal contradictions that already exist within human experience. This is part of why Unfaithful feels so intense and lived in. The emotional weight does not depend on whether a specific real-life event happened. It comes from the ability to understand desire, conflict, guilt, and emotional risk in a deeply human way. That understanding can come from many places, not just literal experience. Within that context, the performance may reflect something broader, not a specific event, but an emotional structure. Moments of wanting something unavailable, moments of staying in situations that do not fully satisfy emotional needs. moments where identity and desire pull in different directions. These are universal experiences, and they often become the foundation of strong character work in serious acting traditions. That thematic thread can be seen across many roles in Diane Lane's career. Characters frequently sit in emotional tension between stability and longing, comfort and change, loyalty and curiosity. The strength of those performances often comes from how familiar those inner conflicts feel, not from any need to link them to real-life events. During the period when Unfaithful was gaining attention, a new chapter was also beginning in Diane Lane's personal life through a relationship with Josh Brolin. The comeback nobody credited her for. For decades, attention has focused on Diane Lane's relationships, heartbreaks, and the search for belonging. But there is another side to the story that deserves just as much attention. The career. Because Diane Lane's professional journey is actually one of the most fascinating parts of the entire story, and it reveals something Hollywood still does not seem to fully understand. After the stall that slowed momentum in the mid-1980s, the comeback began. Not through a massive blockbuster, not through a headline-grabbing reinvention. The comeback happened through television, specifically the 1989 miniseries Lonesome Dove, which earned an Emmy nomination and reminded audiences of something that should never have been forgotten. Diane Lane could act. Then, throughout the 1990s, the career was rebuilt steadily. Chaplin in 1992. A Walk on the Moon. In 1999, a deeply underrated film featuring one of the most natural performances of an already remarkable career. As a suburban housewife drawn toward something beyond the limits of everyday life, Diane Lane brought a level of authenticity that made the character feel completely real. And there is an interesting pattern here. Again and again, the roles centered on women who wanted more than circumstances seemed willing to give them. Women searching for freedom, fulfillment, or a different version of life. Again and again, Diane Lane found something fresh and truthful within those characters. Has Diane Lane ever spoken about being unfaithful in her marriages in a literal, confirmed way? No, there has never been an interview, a confession, or any direct statement confirming infidelity in either of her marriages to Christopher Lambert or Josh Brolin. What has been shared publicly points in a different direction entirely. She has spoken about emotional distance, especially during her marriage to Lambert, where long stretches of separation shaped the reality of the relationship. She has also described a deep desire to belong to somebody, which reads more as emotional longing than any admission of outside affairs. The idea that Diane Lane is a serial cheater or that Unfaithful mirrors her real life comes more from speculation than from anything she has ever confirmed. It grows out of a mix of assumptions, a high-profile film role, and the fact that her personal life includes 2 divorces. Over time, those details get blended together into a narrative that feels complete on the surface, even when it is not grounded in her own words. But rumors like this tend to form for reasons that are not purely factual. They do not need to be literally true to feel believable. There has always been a certain quality in Diane Lane's screen presence that invites interpretation. A sense of openness, a quiet, emotional search. Characters who often seem to be reaching for something just out of reach. When that kind of emotional texture shows up repeatedly across different performances, audiences sometimes begin to merge the character with the person playing it, even without real evidence to support that leap. In more recent interviews, Diane Lane has spoken with a measured honesty about her romantic history, not in terms of scandal, but in terms of lived experience. There has been reflection on privacy, on the difficulty of maintaining a private sense of self while living a public life, and on the importance of providing stability for her daughter, Eleanor, even during periods when personal life itself was less stable. What emerges from those reflections is not a dramatic revelation, but something quieter and more grounded. A life shaped by the search for connection and stability. Choices made within that search that did not always lead to lasting outcomes. Public attention that followed those choices, whether invited or not. And throughout it all, a continued commitment to work and a refusal to be reduced to a single storyline. That is where the rumors ultimately land. Not in confirmation, not in denial, but in the space between public perception and a life that has always been more complex than any single narrative built around it. The Diane Lane. Nobody never see. This is the Diane Lane most people never see. Diane Lane has consistently been described by people who have worked with her as one of the most private major stars in Hollywood. Not in a dramatic or reclusive way, and not in a way that feels calculated. More in a steady, intentional sense. No oversharing, no constant self-exposure through social media. No emotion tells all interviews shaped for public consumption. Just work, and a clear boundary between performance and personal life. That kind of privacy is often mistaken for distance, but it is something more deliberate than that. It functions almost like a philosophy. Growing up in an environment where privacy was not stable or guaranteed creates a different understanding of visibility. A childhood shaped by unconventional parents, shifting circumstances, and constant movement between worlds can leave an early awareness that being seen too fully can also mean being misunderstood too quickly. It also reveals how easily personal life, once exposed, can be reshaped by outside interpretation. Over time, that awareness often becomes structure. Not withdrawal, but control. A way of deciding what belongs to the public space and what remains private. What is expressed through work and what is kept outside of it. That structure has remained consistent across decades in the public eye. From early fame in adolescence to sustained recognition in adulthood, there has always been a noticeable restraint. Even in an industry that increasingly rewards confession over craft, there has been a refusal to turn personal life into constant material. And in that restraint, something unusual has taken shape. Mystery. A performer whose face is instantly recognizable, whose work is widely seen, and whose private life still feels only partially understood. That gap between visibility and knowledge is not accidental. It is maintained through choice, discipline, and consistency. The rumors that circulate around Diane Lane exist in part because there is no competing flood of personal narrative to balance them. In the absence of constant self-disclosure, interpretation fills the space. Stories form. Assumptions repeat. A version of a life takes shape that often says more about public imagination than about lived reality. And the response has never changed. No engagement with the noise, no attempt to correct every version of the story, just a continuation. Work, privacy, and distance from anything that does not need attention. That quiet refusal to participate in the spectacle is one of the most powerful positions available in modern celebrity culture, even if it is rarely recognized that way. There is also a historical echo that helps explain why this presence feels so distinct. Laurence Olivier once reportedly described Diane Lane as a kind of modern Grace Kelly figure. Not only because of beauty or screen presence, but because of composure. A sense of self-containment that felt unusual even then. Fully present, yet never fully consumed by the world around her. That quality has not faded with time. It has simply deepened. Through decades of visibility, shifting narratives, and constant public interpretation, one thing has remained steady underneath everything else. A life that has always belonged more fully to itself than to the story being told about it. So, are the rumors true? The dramatic, salacious version, the serial cheater narrative, the Hollywood scandal framing, the idea of a real-life reflection of on-screen roles carries no supporting evidence. That version is largely projection. It is built from a combination of a memorable performance and two high-profile divorces. Over time, repetition replaces proof, and a constructed story begins to feel like fact. But there is something deeper beneath the noise. A life marked by emotional complexity, difficult seasons, and relationships shaped by history, personality, timing, and long-standing internal patterns that often form long before public attention ever arrives. Choices made in real time, not from hindsight. Experiences that likely carried both fulfillment and pain in ways never fully visible in public accounts. Not a scandal narrative, but a lived experience narrative. And that distinction matters, because public perception often simplifies what refuses to be simple. A public figure becomes a single idea. A headline becomes a definition. A role becomes an assumption. Yet real lives rarely operate in such narrow terms. What emerges from Diane Lane's life is something the internet often resists: complexity without collapse. Two marriages ending does not define an entire life. A film role does not equal personal history. A public image does not contain the full scope of a private reality. Reduction into a single label often reveals more about audience interpretation than about the person being described. At this stage of life, Diane Lane remains active in film and television, continuing to take on roles, continuing to evolve, continuing to work, rather than retreat into nostalgia. Family life continues as well, including a daughter, Eleanor, who is building a creative path of her own in writing and modeling. Life continues forward, without pause or conclusion. What stands out most, when the full picture is considered, is not any rumor. It is continuity. A career still in motion, a life still unfolding, a presence that has never fully settled into any single version created around it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more content like this. There is always more behind the headlines than what first meets the eye, and many more stories worth exploring together. Thanks for watching all the way through and staying till the end. See you in the next one.